Okay, it's February 9th, I think it is, February 9th, and we're doing session 4 with Bonner, and today Lois is joining us. We're going to talk today mostly about security issues, Germany, time in Ann Arbor as the Vietnam War heats up. Bonner, we talked in an earlier interview very briefly about your time in the Army, but mostly against the backdrop of your kind of emerging sensitivity toward other races, people from other backgrounds and cultures. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of your Army experience, including, of course, your experience in a nuclear weapons unit in Germany. Maybe start us out by reminding us when you joined the Army, and get us through basic training, and then maybe over to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and we'll go from there.
Okay. When I enrolled as a freshman engineering student at the University of California, ROTC was mandatory. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't know that. For all male students.
All male students.
All male students.
Not women, but all male students.
By the way, how coeducational was Berkeley in the mid-50s?
Oh, very.
Very.
Yeah, very. But ROTC was required. It was a land-grant college.
Right.
And one of the conditions, and I've been thinking many times I ought to go back and look up the history of the passage of the land-grant legislation, which goes back a long ways. Utah State University, Ohio State, Michigan State. But the University of California was the land-grant school, and one of the conditions was that they had to prepare military officers. And so ROTC was mandatory. They had Navy and Army ROTC units on campus.
Mandatory for 2 years.
So you had to go for 2 years. Mm-hmm. That was mandatory. And then after the 2 years, if you wanted to go on, you could apply for a scholarship to go through your next 2 years.
So unlike today, where an ROTC scholarship would start as a freshman and would pay everything,
no.
Everybody did it. Nobody got any special benefit from it.
Right.
But then after 2 years, you could stay on, and then you would have a scholarship.
But also after the 2 years, there were various opportunities that opened up. For example, enlisting in the Army, and you got credit for those 2 years. Enlisting, going through Officer Candidate School, OCS, or being an enlisted man, a non-commissioned officer. Mm-hmm. You got credit for those years. Okay. So there were benefits to it, independent. But the option on campus was to go on to upper division, and then after you finish the 2 years, then you get your commission. Well, after my 2 years, I went on my mission and was gone for 2.5 years. And then when I came back, there was the threat of being drafted. Civil service, it was a big deal in those days. You had to register, and the penalties for not registering were very high. And so I wanted to go on. I didn't want to get drafted and go to Korea. Korea was the option at that point. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to go in as a soldier. I would not have been a good private. I would have been a terrible private. You know that. And so I went on, got readmitted, got my scholarship, and had a fun experience. I was really good in the classroom. I wasn't quite as good on the drill field. Mm-hmm. I wasn't quite as good going through the infiltration course, but I did it, and I learned to do it well. And fast forwarding a few years, when one of our neighbors criticized me for being in favor of gun control, he said if you'd ever grown up with guns or if you knew anything about weapons, you'd feel differently. And I said, there was always a 12 gauge shotgun and a 30-06 rifle in my home growing up, and my father always went deer hunting and pheasant hunting and duck, and we ate venison and pheasant all the time in the 30s. But in the Army, I learned to handle weapons, and I qualified. I'm an expert marksman. I wasn't enthused about it, but I did it.
Did you consider shooting back when those Klan guys fired at you?
No, I didn't. But I didn't have a gun.
Okay.
Might
Okay.
have
If
changed it.
you'd had one,
If I'd have had gun, okay. I learned to shoot a 45, and 45s are usually better to throw rather than to shoot.
that's what they say. Yeah.
Because it's hard to aim. But I learned to do it and qualified, and an M1 rifle and a Browning automatic rifle and Honest John rocket. So I had a little experience with the weapons, and didn't much care to have them in my neighbor's hands. But anyway, so went through summer camp at Fort Lewis, Washington.
Oh, Tacoma. Okay.
And in Tacoma, and that's where I started to think I can do this, even if it's not my preferred approach to life. And I came out of it with a distinguished rating, which gave me some advantages, and the money was useful. The ROTC scholarship was useful. My family did not have a lot of money. I worked all the time I was in school. I worked in fraternity and sorority houses, washing dishes. Good experience for me. And then I finished and got my commission. And I couldn't qualify for a combat arm because of my eyes. And I had to sign a waiver to go in at all. My eyes were bad enough to get out, to not go in at all. That was at the beginning of the ROTC. But I felt a duty. I was a patriotic, gung-ho kid. And I wanted to be a good citizen. So I had to sign a waiver. So I chose to go in the Ordnance Corps because that sounded like something that would fit my engineering background, and I was kind of intrigued. Nuclear weapons were kind of an interesting deal. We'd gone through the beginning of the Cold War with raids in school, where you had to get under your desk, and everybody had an air raid shelter in their home. Not everybody, but a lot of people built them in. And so it was kind of a hot issue. So I wanted to understand it. It was part of a learning adventure. And if I had to arm a nuclear weapon to learn, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see how close I had to be, or how far I had to be safe. But then there was the high possibility of being sent to Korea. And I didn't want to go to Korea. And so if I signed up for an additional full tour, which meant 3 full years in a foreign tour, I could choose my tour. And so I chose Germany and went for the 3 years.
So you were already committed to going down the route of nuclear weapons, but you could decide where you would do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then I went to Aberdeen Proving Ground for school, and I was thinking it was a couple of 3 months, but I guess it was 6 or 7 months. I lose track of time. Aberdeen was a fun place. It was the site of a lot of research, a lot of development work. It was a key part of the military research and development, R&D work. And so when I got there, that was mostly classroom stuff, because we weren't preparing to be infantry officers. We were preparing to analyze and understand weapon systems.
So you were figuring out the circular error probabilities and those kinds of things.
Oh yeah, and that was fun for me.
Yeah,
that was.
Well, you had engineering background.
That was an intellectual work, and that was fun. So I got through Aberdeen, did well, and then went to assignment at Kaiserslautern in Germany, in the 50th Ordnance Company, and. My first assignment was in a conventional weapons platoon leader. And that was when we were moving in all of our 7.62 millimeter ammunition and getting rid of the old 30.
So moving from basically a 30 caliber to a 308.
Right.
Okay.
And so we had a lot of stuff over there. So we had to move all that out and all the new stuff in.
And when you say a platoon, tell us, what's a platoon size at this point?
90 people.
Okay.
That's a big platoon.
Mm-hmm.
Infantry platoons are more likely 30, but ours were 90. So we had a storage facility at Lorsch, Germany, which was close to Heidelberg on the east side of the Rhine, one of the old German systems with the bunkers where they put their Messerschmitt airplanes and then take them out on the Autobahn to take off and land, and then hide them in the bunkers. We didn't use any of those for air. We used them all for ammunition. And we had a lot of ammunition. We had a huge number of troops in Germany at the time. And it wasn't just our troops. Germany was divided in 4 quadrants. This is all your story. You know all these things with the Soviet and the French and the British and the American. But we had all the ammunition support for the French, British, and German. Mm-hmm. The Soviets, of course, were on the east side, and we were going to shoot them. But we had enormous facilities, and in Augsburg and Lorsch and all the way up north to Cologne, and just a ton of facilities where we had ammunition stored. And in fact, one of the stories was when we were bringing in our new ammunition, I had a young soldier who was not happy with what we were doing, or he wasn't happy with what he had to do. And this was the winter of 60 probably. And it was cold. You know, Germany gets cold and humid. And these guys have to ride from Kaiserslautern to Lorsch, which is about, 100 kilometers, in the back of a 2.5-ton truck. And it was cold and miserable. And they get there, they work, and these boxes. Some of them were boxes of the small arms, but we were also moving 8-inch stuff, which is big and heavy, and the metal is cold. And these people would complain about it, and then we'd send a cold lunch with them. They'd eat a cold lunch and work the rest of the day, and then come home in the 2.5-ton truck. I would go out in a Jeep with a heater in it, and I was not quite sensitive to the reality of the comparison. Finally, one morning, the platoon sergeant comes in and he says, "Sir, Mayday said he's not going out to Lorsch today. Will you come out and give him a direct order?" And so that was the magic. That's what you do in the Army. You give somebody a direct order and then they do it. When it's just a order from a sergeant, it doesn't count. So I went out and said, "John, Mayday, get in the truck and go to Lorsch." He says, "Hell no, Lieutenant Ritchie, I'm not going." One of the key learning experiences of my life. So I could have put him in the court, and I could have put him in the brig that day, a summary court-martial. It's all over. Disobey. But instead I said, "Well, let's talk." That was one of my learning experiences. So we went in and talked, and he says, "Nobody cares about us." He says, "We ride out there in the cold truck, we work all day, we have a cold lunch." He says, it's a bad life. He says, and most of the guys go on sick call anyway when it comes time to go. And they get out. He says, "I didn't want to go on sick call. I just wanted to confront the system." I really loved that guy. Turned out he was a graduate of Columbia University, was drafted after he graduated from college, could speak German, bright guy. So I made him my Jeep driver, and so he could ride in a warm Jeep. And he could translate. I was barely learning German at the time. He could translate, and he was fun to talk to. And he's the one that said, "We don't care about the troops. We need to do things." So I got the whole platoon together and asked them what needed to be done. They said, "We need a place to keep warm out at Lorsch. We need a building, and we need a hot lunch." He says, we've got technology. We've got these Mermac cans that keep food hot all day." He says, "Why can't we have hot food? And we need someplace to go smoke and someplace to relax during the day." And so I put in a order to post engineers for a building. and it was turned down because we weren't there enough. You have to have so many hours a week.
Oh yeah, I remember you telling me this. Yeah.
Occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went, instead of going back to the troops and saying we can't do it, I went back and said, post engineers said they won't approve it. What do you think? And they said, we can do it on our own. We don't need approval. So we're shipping in all this ammunition, and we've got tons of what we call dunnage, which is just lumber that you block in, especially when you're shipping a big stuff, or the boxes. You have to, everything has to be separated, and have to have lots of lumber. So I said, we can build it. So they went ahead and they said, I said, sure. And they were now doing a day's work in 2 hours, and then spending the rest of the time building this facility. It turned out not to be just a warming shed. It turned out to be a German hunting lodge with a nice pine paneled office for me, and a game room and a lunch room. And it was on the edge of the facilities, far enough away from the hot stuff so you could smoke. And it was a great opportunity. I learned a lot. That's where I learned about organization behavior. Mm-hmm. Graduate school was fun, but irrelevant. But that was real learning. So the Secretary of Army comes out for a briefing on, this was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, lots of issues. And we still had, I don't remember it being the news, but we still had a fair amount of domestic terrorist activity going on. Things were blown up. Unknown causes. Mm-hmm. You know, ammunition has a way of blowing up, but somebody has to do something. And we had one incident one time where we had a whole bunch of grenades missing. A bunch, you know,
10,000.
Thousands.
Wow.
And boxes of grenades. And they turned up in Algeria. And it was the Vatican. The Vatican underground spy ring that was channeling stuff from our storage facilities in Germany and France into the Free French forces in Algeria. And that got me interested in international issues. Uh-huh. I thought it was kind of fun, especially the Vatican talk.
How did you figure out it was the Vatican doing it?
Well, see, and this is another learning experience. We had refugees from the East, from Poland, from Latvia,
sure.
from Estonia. You know all those stories.
Several million, yeah.
Tons of these people, and we hired them, and they guarded our facilities.
Okay.
And a lot of them were Catholics. In fact, my guess is the majority. I don't know that we ever inventoried that, but coming from those countries. So they had those ties. They were a close-knit group. Most of them didn't speak German or English, so we had to have translation going all ways, which meant everything was interpreted and reinterpreted and reframed, and they had all their little inside groups, and they wanted to make money. And so they sold our ammunition on the black market to Algeria. They made money, and their link was the Catholic Church.
So they were selling directly to the FLN in Algeria?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the Russians and the Chechen Civil War, where the Chechens don't have enough arms, so they buy them from the Russians that they're fighting against.
The Palestinians were buying their weapons from the Israelis. Have I ever told you that story?
No.
That's another story
All right,
for another day.
That. We'll get to that.
Keep track of that.
All right.
As the PLO said, we buy most of our weapons from Israel. I said, and because they had Uzis, and I knew where Uzis come from. So how do you? What's the transaction? It's through Cyprus.
So these were going to the FLN.
Okay,
great.
And so, but in the meantime, I developed a real sensitivity for refugees, and I'd never felt that before or seen that before. And I think that much of my experience of later years grew out of that sensitivity to the plight of all these people. And one day,
So these are typically what people would call in Germany Volksdeutsche, which is to say they're German, ethnically German, but they've been living in East Prussia and Königsberg and these kind of places that are now part of the USSR, part of Poland.
Yeah.
Okay.
After the division and after World War II,
So this
We
is
had-
President Uchtdorf's story.
we had boundaries that were drawn. But a lot of these peoples were not ethnic German. A lot of them were in fact
Or Slavs. Or,
Slavs or something. And but we hired a lot of these people as guards. And one day when I was on duty, there was an alert that went off. We had lots of alerts. You know, the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis were probably the highlight of an alert culture and moving weapons and preparing for World War III. But we had an alert one day, and it turned out that one of our double fences, you know, all of our highly sensitive stuff, we didn't call it nuclear. It was highly sensitive material. We're behind double fences with dogs and guards in between the two fences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we couldn't put the Estonians or the Polish guys inside the fence. They had
you
to
could put
be
them outside the fence.
they had to be between the fences.
Yeah. Oh, between, okay.
They couldn't be inside the inside fence. That only could be U.S. troops. But between the fences was Estonians with guard dogs. And the alert came in and that we've got small arms fire and dead people. And so I go out and several of these, what we called labor service, the refugees were laying dead between the fences, and the fence had been breached, the outside fence. The inside fence was still secure with U.S. troops, but and the guard dogs wouldn't let anybody near, and so we had to shoot the guard dogs to get to the wounded and the dead Estonians and Polish guys, and then find out that some local, what was the Baader-Meinhof
Baader-Meinhof
gang.
already in the early 60s.
We don't know that that's who
Yeah.
it was, for sure. But
Huh.
that was the assumption,
Yeah.
and that they were trying to infiltrate. But we ended up with a lot of problems during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it didn't hit the press. We didn't notify the New York Times of these incidents.
So these were, but it was clear that it was German. It
Yeah.
was German perpetrators here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now
It wasn't in the press because the U.S. didn't want anyone to know that they had nuclear weapons.
there was an official denial policy,
Or East German communist infiltration.
could have been that as well.
Never knew for sure.
Now, the nuclear units. So, tell us a bit about the nuclear strategy with battlefield nuclear weapons, which we would call them today. I'm not sure what the terminology
I started
was
out
then.
with a conventional platoon.
Right.
And then after a short time, I was moved to I can't remember what we had a really creative name for these units, but they were much smaller. That was about 30 people. The 90-man platoon average education level was probably first grade. That's overstated, but it was fairly low. But in the rocket platoon, it was considerably higher, and it was a very different culture, a very different kind of people, and we had to do maintenance work, and we had Honest John rockets. Now these were surface-to-surface rockets. We didn't have any surface-to-air. That was artillery. We had surface-to-surface,
Okay.
and we didn't fire. We stored them, maintained them, positioned them, but then the artillery would fire them when it came time for a hot war.
And describe the Honest John. What is it? What does it
was,
look like physically?
It was a rocket that was 30 feet long, with either conventional or nuclear warheads on it, and they would go a couple hundred miles. So these weren't rockets that could go into Moscow.
Right.
These were rockets that would knock out the East German and the Soviet troops coming through the Fulda Gap against us.
So they're battlefield weapons. They're not
Battlefield
strategic weapons.
Right.
Our strategic nuclear force at this point is few ICBMs, but lots of bombers, B-52 bombers with nuclear bombs.
And they were based 10 miles away at the Ramstein Air Base, where they had flying nuclear alerts, where they had armed nuclear weapons in the air 24/7. Right. And I knew a lot of those guys. A lot of those guys were LDS pilots.
Yeah.
And my first counselor was one of them. Fun people. My other counselor was a helicopter pilot, Army, and who went to Vietnam and didn't come back. But the strategic weapons were a whole different. We used to talk all the time about the comparison because we expected, 2 or 3 times while I was there, we expected Soviet troops to come through the Fulda Gap. That was the channel that everybody had mapped out for them. Not airdrop, but ground forces. And that's where we were targeting. And that's what we knew, where we knew we could stop them. And we had, I don't know how many 100,000 troops we had over there. Maybe you know, during that time.
Yeah, I wouldn't know the exact amount, but Fulda remains the kind of focal point well into the future. I mean, a town in Hesse where it's sort of good tank country. There's a gap in the Harz Mountains and easy to drive tanks through and cross rivers.
But boy, did we have those targeted.
Yeah.
And we were ready. And it was an interesting time. And, I was relatively young, and I wasn't particularly afraid at that time. But in retrospect, I should have been afraid. And in retrospect, I am afraid of what could have happened and how close things came during that time and the mistakes we made and the accidents we had.
Talk about that a little bit. Accidents. Nuclear. You're in a nuclear weapons unit and you're having accidents.
It's all secret.
It's all secret.
We only had 2 blow while I was there. But they weren't nuclear explosions. See, the technology, and this is way more than anybody wants to know, the technology is you have a high explosive, a dynamite, that implodes, that blows in to create a critical mass of the nuclear material, and then that explodes.
That starts the chain reaction.
And it starts the chain reaction. But you have to arm the weapon in order to have that happen. And there's a technology for that I can tell you in great detail sometime if you want to know. But they weren't armed. And so what you get is a high explosive detonation that blows uranium and plutonium all over the place, which is radioactive, but you don't get a nuclear explosion. And we had 2 of those while I was there.
And you send people out with brooms and dustpans to clean that up?
Right. And military surrounding them to keep the German police and the German citizens a long ways away. And of course they have to be dressed in, ordnance disposal units and protective gear, and that really intrigues the locals. They think that's really interesting, a little scary.
Yeah. Did any of the units ever lose a nuclear weapon?
Yes.
When you were there?
Yes.
How does that happen?
We lost them in the Mediterranean. That's a big story when a plane drops a bomb, a nuclear weapon. But we had them stolen. And we had a truck going from Kaiserslautern to Augsburg that never got there with a Honest John rocket and a nuclear warhead on it. I don't know that that's in the official documents, but it never ended up in Augsburg. We had a lot of military in Augsburg, which is fairly close to Munich.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting because we have a granddaughter that was there on a mission in Augsburg. And I told her to look for it, see if she could find it.
Still missing. All right, so some really critical moments here. So let's move from the day-to-day to some of the big political events of the period. You've mentioned already the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis. What was your vantage point on these mega crises that had the whole world holding their breath? You're in Western Germany, a couple hundred miles from Berlin.
Yeah. We moved into Berlin.
A couple thousand miles from Cuba. But what was it? What was it like?
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we expected action from East Germany and from the Soviets. And so we moved additional weapons into Berlin. And by this time, the Autobahn was theoretically open from Helmstedt
Right.
Into Berlin. And so we sent our convoys to move in. The East Germans decide they won't let us go. And we decide we won't talk to these Germans. I assume you know that. Our orders were really clear. We only talk to the Soviet diplomats or military.
Yeah.
We don't talk to the East Germans. We didn't recognize them as a government or as a legitimate military force. And so they tried to stop us on the Autobahn. And we said no. And so they put the tanks on the Autobahn. And so either you crash into them or you stop and deploy and set up your machine guns and your rocket launchers and tell them to move their tanks. Or, a rocket launcher works well in those circumstances. And I remember vividly the process of telling them to move and them saying no and arming our rocket launchers to knock out the tanks. And then they move the tanks and we move on in.
And you continue to Berlin.
And get to Berlin.
And these were East German units, not Soviet
East
units.
Germany. The Soviet units never gave us problems. In Berlin, we moved back and forth in Berlin. We went into East Berlin during that time also. And the Soviets came into West Berlin. We had fairly good relations, but not with East Germans.
Yeah.
And I was at Checkpoint Charlie the very day that the last sports car ran the gate after they were starting to build the wall. And there was just a gate that came down with a bar, but an MG, the old MGs,
under the bar.
could run under it with 40 people in the car. And I was there. This car ran, and the next car that came, the East German military opened fire. And then they put offsets on the wall so that when you approach it, you had to zig and zag to slow down. They put brick offsets. And then they posted guards with weapons.
Yeah.
And then they put a drop gate that went right to the ground with the steel bars. So you not only couldn't go under it, you couldn't go over it either. You couldn't climb it. It became very dangerous. But I remember standing at Checkpoint Charlie and watching that and feeling the drama and thinking, I need to make the world safe. I need to get rid of all these enemies. That was my feeling.
Cuba.
Where's that?
What's your, actually, you know what? I forgot. I lost track of the time. Yeah.